Welcome to Antidote Radio. This is Greg McCarran.
Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
All right, and here, Antidote Radio, we hope to be the antidote, the solution to all the fake news and alternative facts that are being released out there by all sides, pretty much coming at you from all sides of the media conglomerates that are out there, both corporate and foundation. And whether it's right or left, whether it's internet-based or whether it's television or print-based. So, yeah, there's plenty of alternative facts coming out there. We do the best we can here to try not to deal in that stuff. There will be no fake, exaggerated threats of non-existent terror attacks in Bowling Green, Kentucky, or in Sweden. We won't be promoting these really shady characters who promote these narratives that that there's constantly the constant takeover of your country going on by this nefarious entity that is devoted to bringing in Sharia law. And
in fact, we might hope to be the antidote to all of that. Yeah.
We won't cite any random Fox News interviews like the sitting president of the United States does of certain individuals who promote a narrative of fear and of the brown Islamists taking over your country and wanting to defile all of your women and all that, and convert all your children to Sharia law. So we won't have any of that here. Been a very interesting week, I must say. Interesting couple of weeks, which seems to be the norm regarding the Trump presidency, because there's never a dull moment. That's even the thing his biggest detractors cannot accuse him of being as boring. No, there's never a dull moment.
It would be the best reality TV show if it weren't so serious.
Exactly, yeah. Maybe Donald's buddies, Rahm Emanuel and Jeff Zucker and Sumner Redstone.
Or Ari Emanuel.
Or Ari Emanuel, excuse me. Rahm was the one who he picked his first political fight with very conveniently. Uh-huh. But, Ari Emanuel and Sumner Redstone and Jeff Zucker could help him frame this great made-for-TV narrative for the people of the world, where all the world's a stage. But I think the most interesting development in the last couple of weeks have been these increasing threats of these Jewish community centers and the increasing threat of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish sentiment rising in the United States. We had, in addition to the threats at many of these Jewish community centers, we've had cemeteries vandalized in St. Louis. Some very interesting things happened in St. Louis with, of course, the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, meeting up with the governor of Missouri, Eric Greitens, Jewish Navy SEAL, former, you said Rhodes Scholar as well.
Rhodes Scholar, yeah.
Former Democrat turned Republican, who is David Frum's, according to his podcast with Sam Harris, preferred candidate to challenge Donald Trump in the 2020 Republican primary.
Very interesting.
Yeah, they were out cleaning up the, I guess he's more of a Russophobe, as we'll get into later. But, cleaning up the cemetery together while you have these shady leftist figures like Linda Sarsour showing up and preaching solidarity with the oppressed Jews and Muslims. Are going to come together and hold hands and sing songs together and speak out against the rising tide of bigotry coming from the evil Breitbart Trump wing that is enabling all of these terrible attacks and terrible desecrations of property. So you had that dynamic arising, and then just yesterday, up to 460 headstones were allegedly overturned in Philadelphia at a Jewish cemetery, and now there have been threats at 19 Jewish community centers today, I believe, just today?
At least 10 or something.
Jeez. Yeah, so we're really seeing an uptick in this, and Jeremy, you just want to give your thoughts on what you think seeing happening here based on. Obviously, we come at it from a different perspective. You're going to hear most places, but what is your take on this?
This does have the feeling of a run up to a deep state type of event, from the combination of who's saying what about it or who's not saying what about it. If when it comes to people like Netanyahu and Trump abiling the elephant in the room in terms of anti-Semitism, and why wouldn't they want to jump on it and soothe the Jewish American anxiety in such a time of tension, and it would make Trump more popular with the liberal Jews, and so something weird going on here. And then at the same time, you have people like the head of the SCAN network, the Secure Community Network, which has been identified as Jewish Homeland Security at the big Jewish North American Assembly, General Assembly of all of the Jewish community centers, before introducing Netanyahu as apparently the leader of the Jewish people worldwide. I thought he was the head of the Jewish state. Aren't the Jewish people have our own leaders?
When did he? What is this event you're referring to where he introduced Netanyahu? I'm curious to know that.
This is in the late fall. Okay. Actually, I believe this was after the election. It was in D.C. It was called the General Assembly.
Was it just recent then?
It was probably
late fall. You said.
It was probably in late November or something like that.
Okay.
And Netanyahu was the main speaker, and he'd been the main speaker previous times. And what was interesting, he did talk about how it was an incredible time for Israeli economy, and he had created. Who would have known that we'd have created a relationship with all these African countries, with all these Southeast Asian countries, and it all came down to security. And the war on terror is apparently a boon to the Israeli economy, and so there was SCAN, the Secure Community Network, which we had a sort of off-kilter encounter with at the Kansas City Public Library in terms of the security results of an attack on a Jewish community center in Kansas City, outside of one in Overland Park, actually. That was actually by a guy who was, formerly at least, an FBI informant. Right, who played the role somehow of a white supremacist, a white nationalist, and then he slipped their radar and did this shooting trying to kill Jews. And I guess he didn't kill any Jews, but he killed 3 innocent, sort of like people who were there at the Jewish Community Center trying to enjoy an event. And then in the wake of that, you have this coming in of this Jewish Homeland Security, this Secure Community Network, where it's apparently maybe technology, but definitely personnel were talked about, and so this is interesting. This has the feel of something like that, a run-up to some type of terrorist event of some sort. And then you also see certain people like the head of the ADL, of the Anti-Defamation League. I call him the Defamation League.
Sure.
Jonathan Greenblatt, I think his name is. He was on the PBS
NewsHour.
Alleged NewsHour.
Yes.
And,
Fake NewsHour.
And he was very robotically reading. It looked like some type of statement about the absence of hate crime laws, that there needed to be. We needed to fill out our hate crime laws
on a state by state basis.
Yes,
which is really interesting.
And I guess a lot of states have hate crime laws, but not all do. And then the question is, what is the relationship of these hate crime laws to then? Is there a sense of did hateful speech cause the hate crimes? And if there were to be an attack against a Jewish community center, what would be the after effect of all of that? And then additionally, there's a sense of it reminds me something of the Oklahoma City bombing, where there's this. Well, tell me about you picked up on these different conversations that are taking place from the Breitbart folks, where they're actually trying to make a connection that this might be a Muslim threat against Jews, and not only Jews but against America.
There were two different quote debates that I picked up on within the fake lamestream media. One was on CNN. It was Don Lemon was moderating. It was Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, who's a very big Trump surrogate, Orthodox, very very much in Israel first line of like that whole establishment, as opposed to Israel second, which we talked about before. First is Peter Beinart, very prominent liberal Zionist. Believe he writes for a number of publications. Let's just say he's very prominent. And they were debating the rise in anti-Semitism under in the current environment. And so Peter Beinart takes the standard liberal line that it's because of Trump's election, and Trump is emboldening Breitbart and all these white supremacists to commit hate crimes, he's emboldening them and giving them power to believe that they can do it and they won't be punished for expressing anti-Semitic sentiments and anti-Jewish sentiments, and they feel emboldened under Trump. And the other side is Rabbi Shmuley Boteach is pushing the narrative that it's because of the rise in anti-Semitism amongst the left, aligned with Islam and the Iranians, and the conservatives on college campuses feel afraid, so it's targeting the conservative Jews along with their conservative allies who are speaking out against anti-Israel bias. Whereas the side represented by Peter Beinart wants you to believe that it's the white nationalists, the white supremacists, and they're being emboldened by some of these more hawkish right-wing Zionists who only care about Israel's well-being and don't care if American Jews suffer, and if the great Jewish mission of inclusionary and of inclusion and building this global coalition of where we stamp out all bigotry as being infringed upon by these right-wingers who are and the Boteachs of this world are aligning themselves with these people who only care about Israel. And then on the other hand, there was another debate on The View on ABC between Joy Behar and Joel Pollack, who is the editor of Breitbart. Very interesting, the Breitbart being such an adversarial outlet could get this free publicity on a major network in the prime of the day, by the way. It's very interesting. And they're pushing the same talking points where Joy Behar is hammering him over the head. Your president is not doing enough to counter anti-Semitism, and he's emboldening these white supremacists. And then Pollack runs really the anti-Semitism is because of the college campuses and the liberals and pushing this liberalism and making students afraid to speak out for conservative causes and support Israel and all this. So we've got the narrative where it's very much all in the family, to quote another very prominent Jewish television executive, Norman Lear. It's very all in the, not executive so much as the creator of television programs, but I believe he's People for the American Way, by the way. Norman Lear, it's very all in the family, what we're getting here. It's a very kosher-friendly argument that's breaking out here within the elements of the establishment. But either way, it continues to exacerbate this idea that anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness in particular, because if we refer to Muslims as Semites, then we're evil, bad people. But the consensus seems to be that anti-Semitism is on the rise, and it's something that we must be very vigilant against. And that goes from Amy Goodman at Democracy Now!, who brought on another rabbi on her program today, in addition to bringing on the head of this, Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anne Frank Center. It's prevalent from that side all the way to the Breitbart wing, that anti-Semitism is a problem that must be countered. We just have different ways of going about it. So we're seeing the convergence here of these dueling narratives. But either way, if there is a false flag, if it does, which we suspect is coming, it's going to further exacerbate this narrative of anti-Semitism is the big threat that must be stamped out. And getting into the Oklahoma City thing, it's interesting. It's interesting that initially Iraqis were being labeled as potentially the people carried out the Oklahoma City bombing, but then it was ultimately blamed on a white supremacist type and Timothy McVeigh. So yeah, we've got the dueling narratives, and we're in a situation now where we could be seeing these kinds of attacks coming from both radical Muslims and white supremacists, and creates almost a perfect storm for both sides of this divide.
The perfect what might be seen in the offices of Netanyahu as the perfect Zionist game theory warfare storm of some sort, because of course the Jewish anxiety about anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish sentiments, and then if that were to go hot in the United States in a serious fashion, that's the type of scenario that in the past has been used even worse, has been generated by elements of the Zionist project and the Jewish state, in terms of utilizing general Jewish anxiety domestically to get them to either come or to support or that type of thing. And so the way that these narratives are lining up also to and this, of course, like you've identified with the Oklahoma City bombing, this type of scenario, does it go white supremacists or white nationalists as the perpetrator, or is it the Muslim threat? Is it, or Iraqis or something like that? It seems to be in the fold a lot.
Yeah.
And in this case, in this scenario right now, it may be that there are some type of bubbling plans, if they're not stopped, of a situation where both sides of the narrative get their desired outcome, or what they are saying is the problem. So you might have a situation where there's a white nationalist or white supremacist alleged attack on some just random Jewish community center, and then there might be some Muslim with some type of alleged or implied left connection against some type of right-wing media figure, maybe like a Milo.
What Alex Jones and Milo were talking about, that catalyst for that event that's going to cause like a military presence at college campuses.
You could almost see the punching of Richard Spencer as a sort of precursor to something like that. So it may be that there are plans to deliver the message, the outcome that both sides of these controlled debates at some level are pointing to. And of course, it's the same thing with Breitbart, right? Is Breitbart white nationalists, right?
Yeah.
Is that what's going on here? And there's always this missing Zionist word in the analysis, right? About whether it's coming from the left or coming from the right. And that's clearly what's at play in a lot of this. And the surrounding of this with the Netanyahu trip and the questions by first the Israeli reporter on the first day, and then a Jewish American Orthodox reporter. Yeah. And then the outing by Netanyahu of the relationship with Jared Kushner, which was done in a very sort of like handler type of intelligence type of way. Should I even reveal how long we've known each other?
Exactly.
Jared is what Netanyahu said.
I think a key point to point out with Jake Turks, who was at least the pen name. I don't know if that's his real name.
I think it's a pen name
of this rabbi, of this Orthodox Jewish reporter who confronted Trump. It's interesting. A couple things really stuck out to me. Number one, he represented a publication that was pro-Trump, an Orthodox magazine, where where Trump did an interview, and I haven't been able to pull up the interview in its archives, unfortunately. I believe it was Trump and Jason Greenblatt, who I believe is his chief negotiator in the Middle East now. One of his lawyers. They did an interview together, I believe. And Jake Turks also went on the very increasingly pro-Trump friendly Fox News, on the very Trump-friendly Tucker Carlson program, to say that, well, I think Trump was misunderstood, and I don't think that I don't think he understood my question. I don't think he blatantly intended to be an anti-Semite. So that, to me, gives me the impression that was almost some sort of planted question.
Yeah, and then the question is whether Trump missed the swing or something like that, because it didn't make sense for Trump to miss it other than his narcissism, because it was a guy he knew. There was obviously some friendliness there, and he had been covering him. This Turks guy had been covering Trump for a while,
right?
So there was a closeness there. So Trump either blew it, or there was a plan to blow it. I don't think so. I think Trump actually blew it because of his narcissism, and he thought it was an attack on him, even though the Turks made it as friendly as possible, being like, look, this is not we know Netanyahu has already certified you for as a friend to the Jewish people and the Jewish state. The Jewish American people are worried right now because they're bomb threats, and Trump said, and Trump was pretty nasty to him in a way, and sort of this is the dishonest media for you. You said this was going to be friendly and uncomplicated question, and it wasn't.
Also, in a way, though, Trump's answer played perfectly into the narrative that that certain people want to tell about him too.
It's true. It's true. So then, is that related to his sort of missing the chance to denounce David Duke on CNN during the campaign? Is this much more cleanly organized than sort of like flubs?
Yeah, and by the way, in a future program, we're going to be talking a little bit about Mr. Duke and what we think are some of his very much makes him looks more and more like he's a federal agent of some sort himself. But yeah, that whole thing we very much misunderstood that, where we thought that was like a legitimate being done by a media that saw Donald Trump as an imminent threat to its agenda, when really it was a very carefully, cleverly done signal boosting operation that pretty much sold Trump to this hard right base that Trump pretty much needed.
And Trump apparently knew that was the plan, it looked like, and he knew, I didn't realize it, but that was a key constituency of the campaign, where it was the people who were listening to David Duke. Yeah. And so this is all a piece in a way. This needs to be dealt with. People need to really dig deep in terms of the threats here and to attempt to uncover them. And if things are not prevented, then we have to look at the narratives that are put in place afterwards to think about how we might have to critically deconstruct those.
Yeah, for sure. And I think another thing we're seeing here, we alluded to it during talking about the Greenblatt PBS NewsHour interview, is this increased push for hate crimes and hate speech legislation, which has long been a wet dream of like people on both the right and the left who have this like vision of like this almost police state type environment in America, where really any sort of free speech, especially the sort of speech that is critical of the government or is critical of voices that are really out talking about what's really going on in the world. It's long been this dream of both sides of this establishment to put in these laws that are going to infringe and limit upon the rights of freedom of speech and other important freedoms, which we've seen signs of that, of course. There's been a push for years to try to get laws of this type in place. Of course, September 11th and the Patriot Act wasn't able to entirely do the job, although there certainly wasn't because of lack of effort on the part of the Bush administration and the lapdogs on both sides of Congress, obviously, and the willing media, of course.
And you can even see this just in terms of what I've just learned about the arresting officer at this Kansas City library arrest, where we were basically targeted at some level, likely because of the content of previous speech. And then in arresting me in the middle of a back and forth with a former diplomat to Israel, Dennis Ross, this off-duty detective who works in the Homeland Fusion Center in Kansas City, he attempted to attach an anti-Jewish bias to my arrest record. So this is interesting. I mean, I said nothing that could be considered anti-Jewish, other than I was very critical of state power, and specifically illegitimate state power in the usage of false flag terrorism, both in terms of the U.S. and Israel. So there is an element to this where there is a sense that the kind of speech that we need more and more, speech about deep politics, speech about illegitimate power networks, these types of scenarios, is really what might be being targeted by these elements of the deep state, different deep
absolutely.
States.
And that makes perfect sense, because you consider who the boogeymen are that are being raised up as the threats. Like on one side, it's the leftist/Islamist fringe or part that is being built as a boogeyman, and then the other side, it's the far right, like the white nationalist, white supremacist types that are built as the boogeyman. And in a way, both of these entities, are very much be legitimate threats to an organized power structure when at their root, when you really get like a root ideology together that's not corrupted by like money or by sort of like deep state connections or whatever you want to make it out. And these are the elements of the population that are being threatened. Like we've said before, how we believe that Alex Jones or InfoWars and these entities are being used as like boogeymen with the whole fake news narrative to go after real dissident journalism. And vice versa, on the other hand, we've long known that the left the real radical left is very much a threat to an organized power structure, and that obviously we've seen the watering down of this movement. We've talked about many times in many of our programs. Linda Sarsour, who's been putting herself at the forefront of the Muslim-Jewish alliance after these cemetery desecrations, is a prime example of how these legitimate movements are being watered down. And so when you have these boogeymen that are set up to take these falls after these false flag type events, and you have this increased push for hate speech and hate crimes legislation that's being talked about even on an individual state-to-state basis, it fits perfectly into the hands of people who do want to crack down on speech and activism that they feel is a deep and immediate threat to their narrative or whatever things they're looking to accomplish for America in particular, in the world in general. And I get a feeling that many very otherwise principled, progressive type figures who are people on both sides. Actually, you also get this from like the right, anti-Islam, and there's been very much a meshing together of like these hardcore Islamophobes, these more libertarian, quote unquote, free society type people. And when you get this together, and when you're pushing for a type of hate speech, hate crimes legislation, and this really makes sense that we're going to be targeting this very particular element of the population. But when you put in there these principled people on both sides of this equation are coming more and more, at least from their words, what they're saying and the way some of the sentiments they're making, that they're going to be more or less supportive of, you almost get the impression they can be more or less supportive of hate speech, hate crimes type legislation, because they're so fearful of what the other side represents. Like we've seen the response in to the Milo Berkeley of various otherwise principled progressive figures. Oh, well, we can't debate these people, blah, blah, blah. We can't debate these people because they're a menace. And the other side, of course, believes you can't debate these SJW, snowflake, Islam collaborators, Sharia law collaborators. We're seeing this come together, and I feel like this perfect storm is coming where you could even get the people who otherwise would be opposed to hate crimes, hate speech type legislation on that side supporting it.
There's definitely that danger right now, and with the increasing sense of the left that this is a fascist moment, and that in a fascist moment it's too late to talk to the other side in terms of what they perceive as the fascists. That's definitely a danger, and you could see that like that's sort of what the Milo scenario in Berkeley is hinting at some level. They're not yet at the place of saying that the government should crack down on people's speech, but they're saying we are going to counter people's speech, and not by engaging them in critique or in debating them or destroying their argument, but by physically sort of shutting it down. And then the tendency in the sort of Breitbart right type circles, it's a tendency to typify everyone as this sort of social justice warrior, snowflake, libtard. Yeah. They're immune to facts. They are mentally ill. Mm-hmm. So there's very little place for assembly, for us to actually talk to each other in a direct way. And this is played out by these constructed, controlled figures and narratives on both sides too. If you think about, like you brought up, the Linda Sarsour leading the way in contributing Muslim money, really, to the Jewish people who were under threat, and specifically in relationship to the graveyard stones, I believe. And then the Vice President Mike Pence is physically helping lift up the graveyard stones. And so from Mike Pence, you have direct from the president that this actually may have been his opponents. Trump said that, sort of a hint at a false flag, right? And of course, we have seen stuff like that before, where Jewish people have been caught drawing swastikas or that type of thing. But in this case, it seemed like he was saying that it was the left, or right, his political opponents. The left was doing this in order to make him or his time look bad. And then so there you go. It's the Muslim. No one's saying that the Muslims did this, or some Muslim group did this, but that's in the background in terms of this perpetual tying the left to they want to get down with Sharia and have their daughters wear hijabs, as Alex Jones might say. And then you have Linda Sarsour on the counter here, as part of crew, basically saying, well, this must be Trump having generated a cultural moment where white supremacists and Jew haters feel empowered and emboldened to go down and make bomb threats and shove down Jewish gravestones. But no one in these extremes is pointing out that what does all of this ultimately serve? This serves power structures. Yeah. This is strategy of tension. This is American gladio, and specifically, this ties very much into Zionist gladio of some sort.
Exactly, and that's a key point. Both sides have their preconceived narratives ready for their audiences to swallow hook, line, and sinker. Meanwhile, the most likely scenario of all is this is some sort of intelligence operation, deep state, as you said, gladio type operation, is completely being ignored, except for rare voices like right here, and even the people who in the past would have been exposing this kind of stuff are now on the side of Donald Trump and on the side of pushing the fear mongering. Of course, we've gotten into that before with Alex Jones and those in that particular crowd.
Yeah, and then I think I just want to make one more point based on something that you had said previously, which I think was very, very true, that in terms of the framing of the threats by both sides, it does hint at groups in the United States of America that, in terms of where you talk about where it's sort of framed as a white supremacist thing, really what that was referring to in terms of an authentic American presence that could be perceived as a threat to a power structure, an Atlanticist power structure, but most intensely a Zionist power structure, and that the sort of white supremacist boogeyman is really hinting at the seriously committed patriot right. People who honor both the First and the Second Amendment, who want to have national sovereignty, who understand that there are threats from on high to domestic sovereignty at some level. Yes. So that's meant to disparage that group of people. Right. And then the other side of that, of course, is the feeding of those kind of people into this Breitbart, alt-right, Alex Jones, sort of Zionist-aligned ultimately politics that goes and votes for Trump in order to create what's ultimately an American Likud party. Exactly. That's what the Bannon wants for the Republicans. And then on this other side, you have the global Muslim diaspora, Muslim Americans, the real left, which obviously both of those represent serious, principled potential threats to a power structure based on financial power, based on military power. Exactly. And so both of these have been disparaged as a sort of like the commie, and then the jihadi, and then the white supremacists. These are really stand-ins for authentic groups in the country and in the world that properly expressed represent a serious alternative narrative to the power structure, and most especially the Zionist power structure.
Man, I couldn't have said it better. And as we said, the boogeymen are set up to be the people that are going to be the catalyst to crack down on real dissidents like Richard Spencer or Milo Yiannopoulos or David Duke or whoever, or Linda Sarsour on the other side. Yeah, and of course the movements continue to be watered down, whereas Linda Sarsour, the influence of her combined with all the fear about Trump, is going to cause people who even are willing to look into false flag terrorism, they're going to let their guard down, and they're going to so be bought up into this, the idea that racism is so rampant that they have to buy into the narratives that this is what's happening and that this racism is out of control and it must be confronted. And then here come the hate speech laws, and here comes the propaganda to push for laws that are going to limit and continue to infringe on freedom of speech and expression. It goes on both sides. Now, you mentioned Mike Pence and the I want to get into real quick for a minute the Republican-Jewish Coalition dinner, where Sheldon Adelson made a very interesting comment that Donald Trump could end up being the best president that Israel's ever had. He said that with Dick Cheney sitting in the audience, and we're starting to see the, if not to Trump himself, to the Trump administration, many of these big Republican Jewish donors are really beginning to warm up to the idea of a Trump-Pence administration in terms of their policy towards Israel. What do you make of Sheldon Adelson making a comment like that about Donald Trump with Dick Cheney sitting in front of him?
I'm surprised he didn't make it sooner. And so this is interesting. I think you told me that this was the first time that a American president or vice president has actually gone to the Republican Jewish
Coalition.
I
believe it's something along those lines.
On a Shabbat for a Shabbat dinner, basically. So this is really sealing the deal. Culturally, in a way. And of course, what were they talking about at the Republican Jewish Congress? Did they talk about were they really talking about Jewish American issues, or were they talking about the national Jewish security state?
I would bet on the latter.
That's what I imagine too.
They weren't talking about the threat against leftist Jews, I don't think.
No, because in the eyes of Friedman, right, they are capos. He's apologized for it, but still.
It's much like at the J Street conference that's going on right now. They're not talking about their concerns about how right-wing, how... They're not talking about the issues that right-wing Israelis are concerned about. Well, they might be, but they're taking a much different stance on it.
Yeah, and I mean, but that's what's so interesting is the Republican Jewish Coalition, right? I mean, that sounds like it has to do with like the Jewish diaspora, but it's not. It's basically it's just fully aligned with the Israeli security state is sort of what the deal. And you see this that there has been this turn in the Israeli security state towards the Likud, towards this hard militant right, even more so than it was before. And of course, there was always like terrorism and hardline militancy from before the birth of Israel, but this cementing of the Likud and Netanyahu is very much related to these hardcore American Jewish Zionist Republicans who are very much in bed with the American neocons, some of whom are Israel firsters, some of them who are Israel seconders.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, one big cause for debate at the Republican Jewish Coalition might be what we're about to get into right now, and that's based off of an article, and we've had our feelings about this, two articles in particular, one from Mondo Weiss, written by Philip Weiss, about how no one's allowed to criticize Israeli meddling in American politics, where we can talk all we want about alleged Russian meddling, but you'd better keep your mouth shut about Israeli meddling. And this article's really good. It goes into how Time Warner executives have written speeches for Benjamin Netanyahu, and how I believe it was his AIPAC speech actually, and how Comcast executives, owners of the liberal NBC, by the way, liberal NBC, which was just rehabilitating George W. Bush this morning, we're giving fundraising for the Israel Defense Forces, but I mean. So this article goes into how you're not really allowed to criticize constant Israeli meddling in American politics. And then this other article written by Jeffrey Blankford at counterpunch.org is titled The Putin-Netanyahu Bromance, and he goes into the increased close, what it looks like, strategic relationship between Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu and their respective governments, including Russia tried to keep the UN resolution that was condemned Israel, the Israeli settlements, that Obama was vilified for not vetoing in his last minutes of his presidency, from going into the UN for an actual vote. But there were other factors which kept that from happening. Russia tried to keep that vote from going in, and Israel did not condemn Russia after the actions in Ukraine, despite all the talk about the neo-Nazi elements being involved. And I think, though, what we've seen can be summarized, and I think this could be very well the key to the American Jewish neoconservative opposition to Trump. This could be the key to it. There were a couple of interesting quotes in this article that Blankford cited that was written in a Jewish Telegraphic Agency article from April 2014. American neocons and Israeli right do not see eye to eye on Russia-Ukraine. That's paraphrasing the title. Seth Mandel of Commentary Magazine, which at one point was the mouthpiece for the American Jewish Committee, and Danielle Pletka of the American Enterprise Institute, really notorious neoconservative think tank, both made statements along the lines of, yes, there's a very real difference between American neocons and the Israeli right with regards to Russia. But it's something we're going to keep in the family. We're not going to make a big deal about this publicly. So basically saying that this is going to be kept private and we're not going to make a big deal about this in our media and in arguments with each other. We're still allies and we're still friends at the end of the day, and that's what matters. But meanwhile, all this hysteria about Russia being involved in the election, it really seems to be a smokescreen for Israel, whereas you had the initial reports where we initially believed there very well could have been an effort to try to rig the election on behalf of Donald Trump from elements within Israel. And now we're seeing that with most of these connections that are coming up with these Russian mobsters that Trump is connected to, who are his close confidants in rigging the election or whatever, Russian influence in the election, are actually Russian-Israeli assets.
Uh-huh.
Hope that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, this is what's so stunning about this moment, and relating to this Mondo Weiss article about, no one's allowed to talk about the country that's always meddling in our elections, aka Israel. And then thinking about this Sam Harris-David Frum conversation, where they both are completely agreed that they hate Trump and that Trump is a very dangerous figure. Both of them are basically Jewish Zionists at some level. Sam Harris might push back against that because he's an atheist and he definitely doesn't support the religious state aspect of Israel, but he sees them as less uncivilized, at least, than the savage Palestinian
and the white
militants.
Supremacists, for that matter.
Yeah, right, exactly. And then David Frum, who's actually, I think, both religious, but he's also arch neocon. He's straight out of the Bush administration.
Wrote the Axis of Evil speech.
Axis of Evil speech. He's actually Canadian. His mother was a prominent Canadian journalist. So to see them both talk about the Russian thing, and not anywhere in the conversation did they make any reference or make any connection to Israel, right? But it's on the surface that Israel not only influences elections, right? They own a lot of the Congress, especially when it comes down to sort of issues of foreign policy that the Israeli security state cares about, right? And so to see this it shows how impotent at some level even the U.S. intelligence establishment that's against Trump really is.
Yeah.
And that none of this has been publicized, where it's very clear, like you said, that when you actually get down to do a little bit of granular search on this in terms of who is on the surface, who are these Russian connections to Trump, and you come up with people like Felix Sater, and who's clearly tied into Jewish Russian mob. And then you think back to Roy Cohn. Okay, Trump is a made man of the Roy Cohn establishment. Roy Cohn not only taught Donald Trump many lessons, and I think Donald Trump actually had a picture of Roy Cohn, called him his greatest friend or something like that. So this is not just like a great guy like Trump calls everybody who he's sort of down with in obviously a mafioso type of way. Obviously, that's the way Trump does business. When he talks about great guys, it's like good guy. It's a good fella. He's a great fella. That's what Trump's winking at some level.
Roy Cohn's clearly something different, though, and this was who mentored him, and Roy Cohn was lifelong involved with bad Israeli Mossad connections as well as mob connections. And, of course, Meyer Lansky, a Russian Jew himself, was who Trump got the Resorts International in part from, who was very heavily involved in that. And that Trump got this long-time CIA, Mossad, mob, money laundering business to helped increasingly put him on the map as far as in the being the face of like the American gambling scene.
And that's interesting. So Sheldon Adelson, and sort of back to the RJC, right? This is Las Vegas, right? Yeah. This is Bugsy Siegel, right? This is the sort of the ascent of the American mob, which was largely at the highest levels. It was a Russian Jewish mob that was highly tied to Israel and Zionism, right? So you have Bugsy Siegel's Jewish Russian background, right? Meyer Lansky, Jewish Russian background, and then you come into who's supporting Trump now. It's Adelson Adelson, right? He's a Zionist Las Vegas gambling guy, right? It's Steve Wynn, a Zionist Las Vegas gambling guy. So this election really was at some level, I think, and I've heard people say this, that this was a choice between sort of this Atlanticist Anglo-American empire and the Jewish mob, and the Jewish mob won out in some fashion here, but we're not even allowed to talk about it if you're in any basically circles, even on the sort of like even the alternative media, left and right. There's a sense that it's still about Russia. Is the Russian thing for real or is it not? It can't be. Oh, it's real, but they're hiding the fact that this is a connection back to Israel.
I think it's because it gets too close to where the real levers of power lie. That's exactly what it is.
Definitely, in terms of what we're not allowed to talk about in terms of power. And you mean, because if you really think about how the influence is so pervasive that it's like just become something that you don't even think about in a way. I almost can see that Sam Harris and David Frum are almost immune to like even considering how obvious it is that Trump is some type of Israeli asset of some sort.
But they have to also know that at some level too.
Well, of course, when you actually think about what the things that they say or what they talk about, what you're not allowed to talk about. Or like David Frum in relationship to 9/11 Truth, or Sam Harris in relationship to 9/11 Truth. There's a clear concerted effort to cover something up.
But I think they also both, and David Frum especially, know and understand this divide between the Jewish American neocons and the Israeli right in terms of Russia, Ukraine, which I do think is the key driving. Of course they understand that. And I guarantee if you were to ask David Frum about what his opposition is to Trump, it ain't going to be, and it's not going to be anything related to Israel or related to Iran, which is what a lot of people seem to believe are the big fears with all the people who want to believe that Trump is somehow playing a big game against the Zionists want you to think it's because he's Israel or Iran. No, it has to do, I think, increasingly with this Russian situation.
Yes, and so that ties into this Blankford article, which actually helps to draw out the mechanics of the tightening of the Putin-Netanyahu relationship and this Russian-Israeli relationship in relationship to the United States, which explains this potential split that we're seeing between what might be the American first neocons and the Israel first neocons. And the American first neocons and the Israel second neocons, those are the same people. They are in large part are against Trump because they are most interested, and they're also apparently against the Likud taking the narrative lead in global geopolitics because they are more interested in American hegemony. They live in the United States of America. They don't live in Israel.
Yeah. And they're lashing. It's maybe their way of lashing out at Netanyahu is by beating Trump over the head constantly.
So then you have the Israel First neocons who are also who are really surrounding Trump at some level. They're not afraid of American fascism, because they're really interested in Israeli geopolitics at some level, right? And then so you can start to see this also from an Israeli perspective. That Israel is not obsessed with American power except for how it can serve Israeli power, right? And so you can imagine that Israel being a pretty small country, it's really never probably ever going to be the predominant military power in the world, even though I'm sure they would want to be that. They do use their nuclear power in a very aggressive way, it looks like, in a blackmail type of way, and a Samson option and all of that. But at some level, they do have to deal with the fact that they're always going to have to have alliances with bigger military powers than themselves. Sure. And you would see, just in terms of being smart and tactically, if not strategically, you would align yourselves with. You would not put all your eggs in one basket. Yeah. There would be a key opening up of a relationship of Russia, even if there's a certain certain disgruntlement among certain American establishment. Yeah. I even saw Netanyahu's interview with, I think it was Charlie Rose, and Charlie Rose was being pretty aggressive with Netanyahu about, but why are you so close with Putin and he's against us? And you saw Netanyahu, he was pussyfooting. He knew it was a delicate situation, and at the same time he sees it as key in this ongoing relationship that's deepened ever since the Soviet Union was fallen, and this mass population transfer of Soviet Jews and Russian Jews to Israel that was part of a rightward swing in Israeli politics is all a part of this. And then you can also just think in terms of the warfare thinking, I imagine, in terms of Israel, what they see as their nemesis in terms of Iran and Syria. Yeah. The major backer of Iran and Syria geopolitically would be Russia. Yeah. So at some level, they're going to have they see it as they have to deal with that in some way. And so you've seen lots of diplomatic engagements going back 15 years at least, in terms of someone like Avigdor Lieberman has went and spoke with Putin many times, and there's a closeness there, and that's to even to Netanyahu's right. And then you see the Zionist oligarchs, who some of them who were potentially tied into Putin, such as Mikhail Friedman. This is also there's tons of back channels and tons of very direct material ties from the regime in Israel to the regime in Russia.
Yeah, and to clarify, when we say Israel first as opposed to Israel second, when we refer to Israel first, we're referring more like Breitbart and the people, the Breitbart site, and as well as the people who were coming into Breitbart from to the Trump administration, like this Sebastian Gorka, for example, who's being portrayed as like this, having connections to these anti-Semitic organizations, but in reality, they're a lot closer into what Israel's current, like the right wing in Israel's strategy of tension is, by pushing all this nonstop fear-mongering about Islam.
This is a good point, though, because this complexifies the Trump situation, because at some level there is a real nationalism. There is a real America First part to Trump and the Breitbart people, but it's really mainly economic, right? Yes. And you can see that and you see this sort of this recent proposal to amplify the U.S. Pentagon budget, hundreds of billions of dollars more, that can also be seen as not only creating some jobs in the United States, or Trump trying to rebuild economic infrastructure in the United States, but that's the kind of nationalism that an Israel firster, whether it's Netanyahu or an American Israel firster, can get down with in terms of building up still the most important military partner of Israel.
Yeah, and and as we said with the Israel first, as far as foreign policy goes, like the people that are pushing this Islamophobia and the nonstop points about Islam in general, not just terrorists, but Islam in general being a threat to our civilization and our way of life and to global stability, like Frank Gaffney and John Bolton of the Gatestone Institute, and Pamela Geller and her entire entity and operation. And of course, Stephen Bannon sitting in the White House himself. I think Jared Kushner shares this ideology, which is probably the thing that brings Kushner and Bannon together, even if Kushner has more of a socially liberal background. And then Israel's second would be more like the people we were just talking about, like David Frum and Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan, who have a loyalty to Israel but are very much tied into this Atlanticist establishment that sees Russia as a direct threat to its interests. And that's where the big split comes from, and I think it's very key to understand this split, and I think that is the key that is driving the opposition to Trump. And I think something like the Republican Jewish coalition is very much probably stuck in the middle of that at this point. But they have this understanding amongst each other we're not to talk about this in public.
So it goes back to this is in the family at some level, and that's why David Frum won't bring this very interesting debate amongst neocons into the public.
I was hoping to ask him about it on C-SPAN, but I unfortunately didn't get through the other day. So
so this is a key one to think about also from the Russian perspective too, because you can see why Putin would also want to make sure that he has relations with Netanyahu very directly in terms of the intensity of the aggression against Syria, against Iran. Syria economically definitely represents a key asset, a relationship with Russia in terms of, I believe it's like the access to their only access to their warm water port that they have. Iran is a key defense and weapons relationship that they have. So you would think that if there's any sense that something's going to happen in Syria in relationship to Israel and the U.S., that Russia would want to be in the game, no matter what happens.
Absolutely.
And then also what's pointed to in these articles that you were talking about in terms of these very physical negotiations about Syrian airspace between Russia and Israel. And it suggests a longer-term closeness of relationship and a multilateral nationalism that is very probably much desired by Israel, especially since it wants to work a global war on terror, and that's facilitated and sort of juiced up by security economics, and that Israel is finding a boon, basically, whether it's the United States and all of the Israeli contractors that are involved in the communication systems or in the potential in the building of the wall. And then that's spread all around the world, really. So that's the type of thing you could sort of see a global Cold War type of detente where Israel's actually the new non-aligned party.
There you go. Level. Great point. That's great. And you think about, at the end of the day, it's another win-win for Zionism and for the Zionist power structure, because you've aligned you've still got the establishment liberals in line with the Zionist Atlanticist agenda, and you've got the people who would be most likely to oppose it, as far as like on the hard right, who would be most maybe inherently skeptical of foreign interventions and all that, from having a more traditional conservative / libertarian mindset. They've completely bought into this, because we've had the successful meshing and bringing together of the hard right, anti-Muslim, pro-war on terror, that element with the traditionally anti-war, more libertarian-minded, more conspiracy-minded InfoWars type of crowd. So you've had all the sides of being brought together, and it's a win-win. So either way, regardless of who ends up winning this big battle of chicken, or whether or not they find a final solution, so to speak, that fits, that all parties can agree to, Zionist power structure wins in the end, no matter who ends up which particular entity comes out on top in this battle.
Yes, and the war on terror becomes the key rubric to understand, but also to deconstruct. If we might actually want a multilateral world that includes national sovereignty, but that's not based on a murderous genocidal fraud, ultimately, that basically deconstructs national sovereignty through expansive police states, and then destroys the what should be a real international mutual order, destroyed by aggressive warfare. So, and of course, this is also where Putin never quite blew the whistle on September 11th. He's been key at stopping certain places where, like the Ghouta false flag in Syria, and there were many parties that helped stop the bombing there. But also that it did also soften up Syria by getting rid of its chemical weapon, way of pushing back against Israel potentially. So who knows? But let's keep this moving into the future.
Exactly. And the other key to this is that if we don't tell the truth about this, a lot of people are going to die, and that's the other key to this whole thing. If this power structure wins and humanity loses, and regardless of who ends up winning this battle chicken, we have to be vigilant of what's going on all sides, and to be blowing the whistle about the criminality that we see, regardless of where it's coming from, because at the end of the day, if we don't win out and this organized entity wins out, regardless of which particular side of this, whoever Atlanticist versus hard right-wing Zionism wins out, then people are going to suffer regardless. So we have to be on guard. Anyway, signing out.